Maeve Callahan stared at her reflection in the dark creek water. But the face looking back wasn't entirely human. Crystalline shards, jagged and pulsing with a sickly violet light, were pushing through the skin of her forearms, mimicking the geometric wounds she'd found on the throat of a slaughtered dog. Above her, on the muddy ridge, her uncle Silas stood silhouetted against the storm, a heavy mining pick gripped in his trembling hands. "It's hungry, Maeve," he screamed over the rhythmic, bone-deep thrumming that was making the very bedrock of the mountain liquefy. "It doesn't want your data. It wants the blood of a Callahan to keep it quiet." As the earth beneath her feet began to groan and split, Maeve pressed her headphones to her ears, desperate to drown out the sound of her own skin cracking. Through the static of the subterranean recording, a voice emerged, clear, calm, and unmistakable. It was her father, recorded just seconds ago, though he had been declared dead for 20 years. He didn't offer a rescue or a goodbye. He only whispered a single, terrifying command that made Maeve drop her sensors into the rising sludge. Now, with the mountain literally consuming her soul and her own family coming for her throat, Maeve had to decide if she was the scientist sent to study the anomaly or the final sacrifice needed to feed it. The creek water hissed against Maeve's boots, a thin layer of black scum clinging to the cracked leather. She crouched, fingers numb from the cold, and plunged her arm into the sludge. The sensors had to be here, somewhere beneath the floating debris of rusted cans and plastic shards. Her breath came in sharp bursts, fogging the air as she groped blindly through the freezing, coal-blackened sludge of Blackwood Creek. A sharp edge bit into her palm. She yanked her hand back, blood welling in a thin line across her skin, the metallic tang of the water stinging the open wound. The sensor case, half buried in the muck, glinted dully under the sickly yellow light of her headlamp. She wiped her palm on her thigh, leaving a dark smear on the fabric, and pried the case free. The seal had cracked. Water seeped through the edges, dripping onto the rocks with a slow, rhythmic plink. Maeve exhaled through her teeth, her grip tightening until her knuckles ached. This salvage mission was a desperate race against a clock she couldn't see, but could certainly feel. The environmental degradation of the mountain site was worse than the last survey. The chemicals were turning the waterway into a digestive tract, dissolving everything in its path. If she didn't get these acoustic arrays out now, the data, her life's work, would be nothing more than corrupted silicon. The cold seeped through her waterproof layers, a damp chill that felt like it was settling into her marrow. Maeve checked her rugged watch, the glass scratched from years of field work. The numbers flickered, mocking her. 12:01 p.m. The deadline for her research funding had passed 60 seconds ago. She stood up, her knees popping like dry twigs, and looked at the desolate landscape. The funding was officially frozen. Dr. Voss and the board back in the city would have already signed the papers, effectively stripping her of her credentials and her right to be on this land. She had only hours before the eviction notice would be served at her cabin, turning her from a scientist into a squatter. Every second spent shivering in this creek was a second stolen from the only thing she had left. The truth hidden in the mountain's vibrations. As she reached down to pull the final sensor from the muck near a rotting hemlock root, her hand brushed against something soft and matted. It wasn't the slick plastic of a casing. She pulled back a clump of matted fur, and the current shifted, revealing the carcass of a local logger's dog. The animal's eyes were milky orbs of terror, but it was the throat that made Maeve's stomach turn. It hadn't been slit by a blade or torn by a predator's teeth. The wound was clean, geometric, and filled with jagged, crystalline shards that grew out of the flesh like a grotesque mineral bloom. The crystals caught the dim light, pulsing with a faint, internal luminescence that made the surrounding water look even darker. This wasn't a death. It was a transformation. Maeve's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She reached for her handheld monitor, her fingers trembling as she toggled the frequency settings. A strange, rhythmic vibration was pulsing through the creek water. So low it was more of a feeling than a sound. A heavy, subterranean thrumming that made the black sludge ripple in perfect concentric circles. The equipment recorded anomalous data spikes that defied every standard geological pattern she had ever studied. This wasn't tectonic shift or mining equipment. It was something intentional. The vibrations were artificial, or perhaps worse, biological. They moved with the cadence of a heavy, labored breath, marking a significant and terrifying turn in her research. The mountain wasn't just shifting. It was waking up. "You're a long way from your lab, girl." The voice was like grinding gravel. Maeve twisted, her boots slipping on the greasy rocks. Uncle Silas stood on the bank, his massive frame silhouetted against the gray Appalachian sky. Behind him stood a group of miners, their faces smeared with coal dust and hostility, their eyes reflecting the same hard, cold light as the mountain's granite. Silas didn't move toward her. He simply leaned on a heavy walking stick, his presence a wall of silent judgment. The miners shifted restlessly, their breaths coming in white plumes. They looked at the dead dog, then at Maeve, and the air between them thickened with an unspoken threat. The arrival of Silas was the final nail in the day's coffin. A direct confrontation that Maeve had been dreading for months. "The board called," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, grating growl. "You're done here, Maeve. Funding's gone. Permission's pulled. This is private mining property, and you're officially a trespasser." He stepped closer, the mud sucking at his heavy boots. "I told you years ago to let the dead stay buried. But you Callahan women always did have a habit of digging until you found something that bit back." He gestured to the miners, who began to fan out along the bank. Silas wasn't just there to talk. He was there to enforce a silence that had been decades in the making. "I'm not leaving until I get the rest of my gear, Silas," Maeve countered, her voice sharp despite the tremor in her hands. She gripped her heavy sampling pole, a 6-foot length of reinforced steel, like a staff. "That gear belongs to the company now," Silas spat. "Consider it payment for the trouble you've caused. Leave now, or we'll make sure you can't walk out on your own." He took another step, his eyes fixed on the sensor case in her hand. The ultimatum was clear: her safety or her data. In Silas's world, there was no room for both. The tension snapped when one of the younger miners, a man with a jagged scar across his chin, lunged forward. He didn't go for Maeve. He went for the sampling pole, his hands grasping at the cold steel. A violent physical scuffle erupted in the mud. Maeve didn't hesitate. She twisted the pole, using the miner's own momentum against him, and the two of them went down into the freezing water. The sludge sprayed upward, coating them both in black filth. The miner's fingers clawed at her jacket, his breath hot and smelling of cheap tobacco and desperation. It was a messy, desperate struggle in the treacherous creek bed, the sound of splashing water and grunts echoing off the steep ravine walls. Maeve's survival instinct, honed by years of navigating the unforgiving terrain of Blackwood, took over. She planted her feet in the muck and used the sampling pole as a makeshift lever. With a sharp, guttural cry, she struck the aggressive miner across the chest and shoved him back. He lost his footing, his arms flailing as he splashed into the shallow, freezing center of the creek. He came up gasping, the acidic water stinging his eyes. Maeve stood her ground, the pole held ready, her chest heaving. For a moment, the other miners hesitated. surprised by the ferocity of a woman they had dismissed as a book-smart ghost chaser. She had regained temporary control, but the look in Silas's eyes told her the real fight hadn't even begun. In the chaos of the miner scrambling to his feet, Maeve saw her window. She backed toward a massive, hollowed-out log that had fallen across the creek years ago. With a quick, practiced motion, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, secondary recording device. The one she hadn't declared on her inventory. She shoved it deep into the rotten wood of the log, wedging it into a crack where the mountain's vibrations would be loudest. If they took her main gear, they wouldn't find this. It would sit here in the dark, listening to the mountain's heartbeat while she was hauled away. It was a tactical gamble, a way to ensure the data collection continued even if she was silenced. Silas watched her, his jaw tight. He didn't see the small device, but he saw the defiance. "Fine," he growled, waving the miners back. "Keep your scrap metal. But if I see you on this ridge after sunset, Maeve, I won't be sending the boys to talk. The mountain's got enough holes for one more body." He turned and began the long trek back up the bank, his men following like a pack of wolves. They left an ominous silence in their wake, a heavy, suffocating stillness that felt more dangerous than the shouting. Maeve stood alone in the darkening woods, her clothes soaked through with freezing sludge, her body shivering violently as the adrenaline began to fade. She waited until the sound of their boots died away before she moved. The trek back to her makeshift camp was a blur of exhaustion and cold. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward her, every snap of a twig sounding like a footstep. Once inside the small, corrugated metal shed she called a laboratory, she stripped off her wet clothes and wrapped herself in a wool blanket that smelled of wood smoke. Her hands shook as she pulled the primary sensor's data onto her laptop. She needed to process the day, to find some logic in the crystalline dog and the rhythmic hum. She pulled up the audio file from the morning's recording, the one she'd captured just before the fight. She hit play. At first, there was only the white noise of the creek and the distant groan of the wind. Then, the low-frequency thrumming began. Maeve leaned closer to the speakers, her breath hitching. The noise shifted. It wasn't a mechanical pulse. It began to modulate, the frequencies stretching and folding until they formed a recognizable cadence. Maeve froze, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Through the static and the subterranean rumble, a voice emerged. Distorted, hollow, as if speaking through miles of solid rock. "Maeve, find the seam." It was her father's voice. Richard Callahan, who had disappeared when she was 12, his body never found, his gear left at the mouth of a shaft that shouldn't have existed. This was impossible. The recording was fresh, captured decades after he was declared dead. The sound sent a cold, supernatural shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the creek water. She wasn't just a scientist anymore. She was a daughter hearing a ghost, and the mountain was the medium. The peace of the recording was shattered by the sudden, violent glare of red and blue lights reflecting off the shed's metal walls. A siren let out a short, authoritative chirp. Maeve scrambled to the window, her heart jumping into her throat. A cruiser sat idling in the dirt at the edge of her clearing. Sheriff Miller stepped out, his silhouette long and imposing in the headlights. He wasn't there for a welfare check. He held a paper in his hand, the arrest warrant for the assault on the miner. "Maeve Callahan, open up. I have a warrant." She didn't hesitate. She knew Miller. He was on the company payroll, a man who saw the mountain as a paycheck and Maeve as a nuisance. If she went to jail now, the recording would be lost, and the mountain would swallow the truth. She grabbed her pack, shoved the laptop and the sensor case inside, and slipped out the small back window. She hit the ground softly just as the front door gave way, with the splintering roar of a battering ram. She didn't look back as she sprinted into the tree line, a fugitive in the only home she had ever known. She climbed high, reaching a rocky outcropping that overlooked her camp. From the shadows of the pines, she watched as a second vehicle arrived. Silas. He didn't talk to Miller. He walked straight to the shed with a jerry can in his hand. Maeve watched in silent, agonizing horror as he doused her perimeter laboratory in gasoline and struck a match. The explosion was small, but the fire was hungry. The flames consumed her hard drives, her soil samples, and years of baseline data in a matter of minutes. The orange glow lit up the underside of the canopy, a funeral pyre for her career. She had nothing left now but the gear on her back and the voice in her head. "I have to go deeper," she whispered to the dark. The only way to evade Miller's search party was to head where no one in town dared to go: the restricted Old Blackwood Zone. It was a place of local legends, of thin spots where hunters disappeared and the trees grew in shapes that defied geometry. She crossed the rusted barbed wire fence, the metal groaning as she pulled it apart. The warning signs were faded, bullet-ridden relics of a corporate era that had ended in blood. She stepped over the threshold, ignoring the sudden, heavy pressure in her chest. As she trekked deeper into the dense hemlock forest, the world began to warp. She pulled out her compass, but the needle didn't point north. It spun in frantic, erratic circles as if searching for a pole that was moving beneath her feet. She clicked on her flashlight, but the beam was weak, flickering and dying despite the brand new batteries she'd installed an hour ago. The air felt thick, like water, and the silence was absolute. No birds, no insects, just the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears. These weren't just anomalies. They were signs that she was entering a zone of extreme spatial distortion, where the mountain's will superseded the laws of physics. The fog rolled in, a cold, gray curtain that smelled of wet stone and old copper. Maeve slowed her pace, her hand resting on the bear spray holstered at her hip. A shape emerged from the mist, standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail. "Hello?" she called out, her voice muffled by the damp air. The figure didn't answer. It was a man, or it had been. He wore the tattered flannel of a missing logger, but as Maeve stepped closer, she realized the proportions were wrong. His arms were too long, his fingers fused into jagged, spade-like points. When he turned his head, there were no eyes, no nose, just a featureless, mutated mask of pale, translucent flesh that pulsed with the same rhythmic vibration she'd heard in the creek. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a physical manifestation of the mountain's hunger. The creature didn't growl. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a pipe, and lunged with unnatural speed. Maeve barely had time to react. She yanked the bear spray from its holster and unleashed a cloud of orange mist directly into the creature's face. The logger shrieked, a high, discordant sound that vibrated in her teeth, and clutched at its featureless head. The industrial-strength capsaicin seemed to affect whatever remained of its sensory organs. Maeve didn't wait to see if it would recover. She broke away, her boots pounding against the mossy earth as she sprinted toward a steep ravine she knew lay just ahead. The pursuit was a nightmare of snapping branches and heavy, uneven footfalls behind her. Maeve reached the edge of the ravine, the ground slick with ancient moss and the beginning of a light rain. She tried to pivot, to find a path down, but her foot hit a patch of loose shale. She went over the edge, the world spinning into a kaleidoscope of gray rock and dark green needles. She tumbled down the rocky slope, her pack slamming into her spine, her shoulder barking in pain as it hit a protruding root. She landed hard at the bottom, the breath driven from her lungs in a sharp wheeze. She lay there for a long time, the rain falling in a steady, cold drizzle on her face. Her shoulder throbbed, and her vision swam, but she was alive. As she struggled to sit up, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic buried in the mud. She cleared away the leaves and grime, revealing a half-buried metal briefcase. It was heavy, the corporate seal of Blackwood Mining Corp. Still visible through the rust. She used a sharp rock to pry the lock open, her heart racing. Inside were waterlogged but legible papers, classified documents detailing Project Chimera. It wasn't about coal. It was about a biological anomaly, an ancient organism fused with the mountain's core. As she scanned the pages, a name jumped out at her. Callahan. Her father hadn't just disappeared. He had been a primary consultant. Her family hadn't been victims of the mountain. They had been its keepers for generations. The mining operation was a front, a desperate attempt to excavate the heart before it could fully wake. The accidents weren't rockfalls. They were the mountain defending itself against the ritualistic excavation. This revelation changed everything. She wasn't an outsider. She was a part of the cycle. A sudden, high-frequency hum began to vibrate through the ground, so intense it made the air shimmer. Maeve winced, a sharp pain lancing through her skull. She reached up to her face and felt something warm and wet. Her hand came away red. Her nose and ears were bleeding, the capillaries bursting under the pressure of the sound. The mountain's heartbeat was reaching a terminal frequency, a crescendo that would soon become lethal to anything with a nervous system. "The altar," she gasped, the word tasting of copper. She knew where she had to go. The documents pointed to the humming altar, a natural resonant chamber at the mountain's literal heart. It was the anchor for the anomaly, the place where the vibrations originated. If she could reach it, if she could record the final proof of the mountain's sentience, she might be able to stop the excavation, or at least warn the world before the mountain tore itself apart. The hum intensified, and around her, the ancient hemlocks began to shudder. The bark on the trees split with the sound of pistol shots, and the air grew heavy with static electricity, making her hair stand on end. Maeve struggled to her feet, clutching her pack to her chest. She began to climb, heading toward the epicenter, her vision blurring as the crystalline scarring she'd seen on the dog began to itch beneath the skin of her own neck. The sky turned a bruised purple as a violent summer storm erupted over the peaks. It wasn't a normal rain. The water came down in sheets so thick they felt like a physical weight, triggering a massive mudslide on the slopes above. Maeve watched in horror as the only access road, the thin thread connecting her to the world, was washed away in a roar of tumbling earth and uprooted trees. She was trapped now, isolated in the high altitudes where the air itself seemed to be vibrating with malice. The hum became a physical force, cracking the bedrock beneath her feet. The ground shifted and groaned, the very bones of the mountain rearranging themselves. Maeve found herself forced to her hands and knees, crawling toward the higher, more stable ground of the summit. As she moved, the auditory hallucinations began. A deafening scream that wasn't a sound, but a psychic assault. She heard her father's voice, Silas's threats, and the roar of the mountain merging into a single, chaotic wall of noise that threatened to shatter her sanity. She found a shallow cave near the ridge and collapsed inside, gasping for breath. In the back of the cave, tucked behind a loose stone that looked too deliberate to be natural, she found a leather-bound book, her father's field journals. These weren't the sanitized reports he'd sent to the company. These were his true observations. He spoke of the mountain as a living neural network, and he described a theoretical method to neutralize the vibrations using a specific harmonic frequency. He had even drawn a map, a secret path to the altar that bypassed the company's sensors. "I can do this," she whispered, her fingers tracing the faded ink. But as she turned to leave the cave, a shadow blocked the entrance. Silas stood there, drenched and wild-eyed, brandishing a heavy mining pick. He didn't look like her uncle anymore. He looked like a man possessed by a terrifying, singular purpose. "You should have stayed in the creek, Maeve," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "The mountain's hungry. It's been hungry since your father left it empty." He stepped into the cave, the pickaxe held low. He confessed then, his words tumbling out in a feverish rush. He wasn't just a miner. He was a zealot of an old, dark faith. He believed the mountain demanded a blood sacrifice to be quieted, and he had been the one feeding it for years. Richard hadn't disappeared. Silas had offered him up. And now, with the frequency reaching its peak, he believed only a Callahan's life could appease the anomaly. He lunged. The pickaxe whistled through the air, embedding itself in the wooden support beam where Maeve's head had been a second before. She scrambled into the rain, the mud turning the fight into a brutal, sliding struggle. Silas was stronger, fueled by a madman's conviction. But Maeve knew the terrain. She lured him toward the edge of the ridge, toward a spot where the journals had noted a rain-weakened sinkhole. "Come on, Silas," she screamed over the wind. "Finish it." He lunged one last time, his face a mask of fury. Maeve stepped aside at the last possible second. The ground gave way beneath Silas's heavy boots with a sickening crump. He didn't even scream as the earth swallowed him, the mud and rock closing over his head in a matter of seconds. Maeve stood at the edge, her chest heaving, watching the spot where her uncle had vanished. She was alone now, the last keeper of the secret. She walked to a rainwater puddle and looked at her reflection. The crystalline scarring had spread, a jagged, beautiful, and terrifying pattern of blue-white shards emerging from the skin of her neck and jaw. The environment was rewriting her, turning her into a living extension of the mountain's nervous system. She could feel the heartbeat now, not as a sound, but as her own pulse. The trash chute of the mountain opened. A massive hemlock, its roots loosened by the slide, groaned and fell, pinning Maeve's legs against the steep slope. The pain was white-hot, but it was the sight of a hand clawing out of the mud that truly terrified her. Silas. He had survived the sinkhole, his body mangled and coated in black sludge, but his eyes were still bright with madness. He crawled toward her, a ritual knife clutched in his hand. "Blood, for the stone," he wheezed. Maeve looked up at the sagging timber of an old mining shaft just above them. She didn't have the strength to fight, but she had the knowledge. She kicked at the rotting support beam with her free foot. The structure, already under immense pressure from the mud, collapsed instantly. Tons of timber and rock buried Silas, this time for good. She pulled herself free from the hemlock, her legs bruised but not broken. She reached the humming altar at the very peak, a place where the rock was translucent and pulsed with a blinding light. She found her father's final recording there, tucked into a crevice. He hadn't been a victim. He had been the mastermind, trying to contain the entity by any means necessary. He had become the monster to save the world. Maeve didn't hesitate. She used her geological expertise to place her remaining survey charges on the structural seam her father's voice had mentioned. As the crystalline scarring blurred her vision, she hit the detonator. The explosion wasn't just fire. It was a severance. The mountain roared, a sound of ancient, agonizing loss, as the altar was buried under millions of tons of stone. The hum stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so loud, it made her ears ring. She limped down the mountain as the storm broke, passing the ruins of her life. She saw the sheriff's lights in the valley, but she stayed in the shadows. She was a pariah now, a woman who had destroyed a town's livelihood and murdered her uncle. She reached her porch and watched the sun rise over a silent blackwood. The scars had faded, but the vibration remained. She looked at her hands, watching them tremble in perfect synchronization with the deep, internal heartbeat of the earth. She had saved the world from the sound, but she had become its new vessel. She sat in her chair, a silent guardian, an inseparable part of the mountain's enduring, hungry mystery.